Hi, hello, everybody. Welcome back to the next episode of the Truthful Ministry podcast. If you didn't hear, Cody is back. Cody's going to be here sticking around for a while, me and him.
Good to be here.
And
Happy about it.
yesterday, or our last message that we gave here on the pod was about the first message that we gave at the fall retreat. Cody and I recently spoke together at a fall retreat for Cody's youth that he leads, and we kind of split up the messages. I did two, he did two. And the way we did it, even at the fall retreat, was I gave the first one, Cody gave the second one, I gave the third one, and then Cody gave the fourth one. So we kind of went back and forth. And so these next few episodes of the podcast, we're going to be talking about what we discussed in those sermons. We're not going to literally just be preaching into the mic, so don't worry. This isn't like us just giving a sermon. We're just going to be talking about what was going through our minds and what we preached and kind of what we liked about it and what we feel like it impacted, how it impacted the students, things like that, and just discussing our thought process behind why we said the things in our messages that we did, and also telling you all about just how cool we think some of these scriptures are, because we didn't just throw things together that we hated. We didn't just get up there to just read some boring stuff. Like we both like love the word, and we both love preaching and teaching. So we're just gonna share a little bit about that stuff with you all. So Cody, your message is what we're gonna be talking about this episode this week. So,
but before I get into that,
okay,
I'm just curious. I just want to hear your thoughts. Like we both play video games. We both like video games, and I know growing up, and even still today, there's some rhetoric around video games that they're nothing but a giant waste of time, and sometimes they are. And there's nothing of value to be gained from video games. But I know I've got one that I'll share for this. I already have my answer. But
okay.
Are there any video games that you remember playing that were like, I learned a lot of things just from like playing this game? Like maybe learn things about history, learn things about
100%.
the way people work. Like, is there anything that comes to mind as like
100%.
this game was really educational in a weird way?
I genuinely feel like I said this for a long time. I don't know what your answer is going to be. Maybe I'm stealing your answer, but I always said Assassin's Creed. Like the Assassin's Creed games obviously are like embellished in a way, but it's like it's history. Like you're playing through European history. You're playing through like the American Revolution. You're playing through the French Revolution during these, like that's the setting. And so they usually have like some important characters from real history in those games. And they always like show the dates on the screen. And if you're really into like the lore of the game, because even though the history's happening, it's obviously really focused on like the assassins and this like secret organization. But I'd always pay attention to like the dates, because that tells me which assassins were alive and where and what was going on in the world. And so like I genuinely learned, I feel like, a lot about history in that. And then I also just think in general, like puzzle solving, like this is a crazy example. This is the last one I give. Have you ever seen the Nancy Drew games? Like the Nancy Drew detective games? They're just kind of like point and click. You move around and there's a mystery. Every single Nancy Drew game, basically. I remember like I have an older sister, and so that was one of her favorite games to play when she was growing up. And so I'd always sit there and kind of watch her play. Basically every single Nancy Drew game at some point had a puzzle where it was like, all these books need to fit into this drawer, but they're like different sizes and shapes. And so you had to like literally organize the books or some rendition of that. Like, oh man, all of these, like it's a puzzle where all of these blocks, if you put them together in a way that they all fit, they'll make an image. And so literally just like putting shapes in the right spot. And I always think about, to this day, anytime I'm organizing books or like putting things into a container, I'm always like, Nancy Drew taught me this. Like this function of recognizing what shapes will fit where was like something from those games. So I have all kinds of random small examples, but I think Assassin's Creed is the biggest one.
Yeah, similarly, but not similarly at all. Mine is also a historical kind of answer, but in a completely different bent. For me, I've always loved playing like strategy games and like grand strategy games, and the king of grand strategy, it's a contested seat, but one company, Paradox Interactive, they make these games, the Crusader Kings games and Europa Universalis, and they're these strategy games that are take place using actual historical maps, and they try to be historically accurate about like, here's all these kings and dukedoms and counties and barons, and they have very detailed. You can even, I remember in Crusader Kings 2, you could click on a character, and if they were an actual historical character, there would be like a link to their Wikipedia page.
That's cool.
And like I know playing those games, I learned about how like medieval governments kind of functioned. I learned terms like primogeniture, succession from playing those games. I learned kind of geography and and historical figures playing those games, and they really, I think the way those tie with Assassin's Creed is like they're not going to give you like a robust historical education, but for like a kid playing those games, made me see how cool and interesting history could be to study and learn more about, and kind of brought it to life a little bit. But I think the Assassin's Creed games in particular really do a good job of like helping you put yourself in the shoes of people from a different place and a different culture and a different time, and really remember these aren't just names in a textbook. These are people that lived real lives in a real place. One other game that fights, one game series that fights for the title of King of Grand Strategy is the Civilization series. And with my message, Call to Live, I talked about the impact Civilization had, that game had, in my life in a weird way as far as my relationship with God goes. So this is my really professional segue into the topic.
I knew where you were going.
I'm sorry, he caught on. But I talked about how in Civ 5, which I played a lot when I was a middle schooler, the first few texts that you would research in this game, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry about it, but you'd research these technologies, and then whenever you did that, a narrator would pop up and he would read some little blurb that was related to the text. It was just this thing they did for fun to add a little flavor to the game. And a lot of the earliest texts were Bible verses that they would use. And I shared with the students before I was ever even, I think, a Christian. I had a couple of Bible verses memorized in the King James version because of this game that have stuck with me. And one of them is Psalm 90, verse 12. And the guy would, when you would research the calendar, he would read this verse. He says, "So teach us to number our days, that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom." And that kind of led into this topic for the message Call to Live. Because you see this theme laced throughout the scriptures, that to truly live, you have to acknowledge who you are as a human. You have to acknowledge your limitations, and one of those limitations is that you're going to die one day, that your time is limited. And so we need to consider how to spend our time as wisely as possible. That's essentially what the verse in Psalm 90, verse 12 is saying. You're going to die one day. I'm going to die one day. Christ is going to return potentially before that happens. But either way, our time is limited. And so how are you going to spend it? What's the best way to spend it? And that kind of segued into us dipping into the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, we were talking a little bit before we started recording how I love Ecclesiastes. You like Ecclesiastes. I don't know which one of us likes it more.
You probably do more for sure.
I'm a nerd for Ecclesiastes. And I think it was one of those books that was always appealing to me because it has this reputation for being this really depressing book. And, in some ways it earns that reputation. But to me, the message of Ecclesiastes is one of the most encouraging, just uplifting messages that if we can understand it and embrace it, brings so much peace to your life.
Yeah.
And I think, and I'll get to this later on, Jesus, in one of his key statements about what it means to follow him, is appealing to the message of Ecclesiastes, to talk about this is the kind of rest and peace that comes from following me. I'm just going to read here a little bit of Ecclesiastes 1, just to kind of get us going. In Ecclesiastes 1, it starts, "The words of the preacher," your Hebrew word for the day is kohelet. That word preacher is translated from the Hebrew word kohelet, which can be preacher or teacher or speaker. But he's the kohelet, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. And then he has this poem that opens up the book that is just, you read it and you get this sense of a guy who just seems very optimistic about life. He says, "Vanity of vanities," says the preacher, "vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? A generation goes, and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down, and hastens to the place where it rises. The wind blows to the south and goes around to the north. Around and around goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they flow again. All things are full of weariness. A man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, 'See, this is new'? It has been already in the ages before us. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of later things yet to be among those who come after." So again, just you read that and you're like, this guy seems like someone that I'd like to sit down and have a fun conversation with. But he uses that word at the beginning there, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. He repeats this throughout the book. And I talked with the students. I like to give them a little bit of the original language here and there if it's relevant. You did this in the first message. You talked about in the Greek the
charismaton. Yeah.
Charismaton. Well, the word there used in the Hebrew is hevel or hebel, depending on how you say it. And what that word literally means is like a smoke or a vapor. And so what does it mean to say that life is like smoke or a vapor? Mm-hmm. We see, James references this idea in the New Testament. It's referenced in some different places in the Old Testament. But it's this figure of speech. And I had this really cool illustration I was going to do with the students, and then I just didn't. I just kind of forgot to prep it. I was going to light a candle and have it make a bunch of smoke, and I was gonna have one of the kids come up and be like, try to grab the smoke. Mm-hmm. See if you can I'll give you $1 if you can grab it and keep it in your hand and take it back to your seat with you. And I know there would have been some sixth grader that would have been down to try it.
Yeah, for sure.
And he comes up and you would go to do it and the smoke would have just gone through your hand, right? Mm-hmm. You can't grab a hold of it. But that's the idea of hevel. And comparing life to that, it's enigmatic. It's difficult to control. We think sometimes that we can reach out and grab it. Just like smoke kind of looks like maybe you could control it. Maybe there's something to it, but the moment you try, it slips through your fingers. You can't really understand it as well as you think that you might. But that's life sometimes. That's life all the time, according to the Kohelet. And so that kind of was the starting place for us going into Ecclesiastes. Before we go on, I'm just curious, as we were talking about using some of the kind of original language in our teaching, what are your thoughts on that? What's the place of using and referencing some of the original language? Is it something that should be done as often as possible? Is it something that can make you come off as pretentious if you do it? Or is it just confusing and should just be left alone? What are your thoughts?
I think it's just a helpful resource. I think it does two things. I think one, it grounds the sermon in saying hey, these aren't just words that someone wrote yesterday. This was wrote a while ago, and we're still studying it. It still makes sense today, mm-hmm. because here's this language that was written in back then, but we understand it now. And I think also as the speaker, the person teaching on it shows Cody cares about this message. You didn't just work this up because you're the person who's supposed to speak at the fall retreat. You care enough about the message to look into that stuff and to know that stuff and to study it. And for you, taking a class in Hebrew, it's you're not just doing that because you have to. It's you wouldn't be doing it if you didn't want to some degree, if you didn't feel called to do it. And so I think that shows intentionality on your end. But I think overall I would say it just grounds us and gives us a better understanding of what the author was going for. And I think especially nowadays, that's huge, just because people are searching so much for something that feels real. Mm-hmm. And I think it makes it, I would say, me personally, that it makes it less churchy to say, hey, here's what the author originally wrote. because it's not you just spouting verses. It's like, hey, we're gonna really look at what this meant, and like how can we look at, like, kind of even the alternatives. Like you said, there's a different way to pronounce it. It's like right off the bat, you're saying like, hey, this is our best understanding of what it originally means, but it's not you just saying, here's this verse and you're gonna live by it and you're gonna do it. It's like, well, let's talk about it in a different sense. Let's remind you that who the person that wrote this was and what they were going through in their life, versus just, hey, here's this verse that's just kind of, it exists and it floats in the wind, and now I'm going to read this verse to you, and now you're going to go and live a certain way. It's like, hey, here's what this person was doing, and you're going to get into that, I'm sure, here in a second, but
Yeah.
talking about the author, I think it's very helpful. I think it's very helpful for sure, and even in my case, like last episode when I talked about like charismatone is just that extra emphasis of like, hey, when it says gift, what it literally means is like gift by grace, and like that reminder of like, here's what the author was really trying to say when they meant this. It's just a different perspective that I think is always helpful. I would say it's beneficial 99 times out of 100 for sure.
Yeah, I think that you can use it in a way that's unnecessary, like if you're just trying to show off that you know stuff. But I have a seminary professor who would say, you know, in regard to this question, he would say some people say that you should never use the original language because the average person doesn't know the original language and it'll come off as pretentious. And he says, if you're pretentious, they already know that about you before you're doing that. So you're not really saving anything. And he said, in fact, he finds that it's actually a little condescending to assume that your audience isn't aware of the fact that the Bible wasn't written in English. And so there's a degree to which even referencing it here and there can help to like enlighten the imagination of the audience member of like, oh man, this was written in a different language, and there's more I can dig into this and see some more of the inner beauties of the original.
And I think it makes like the person listening to the message feel like they learned something too. Like at the very least, if like someone is like, dude, all this theological stuff, like I just don't know. It's like they can walk away being like, oh, I learned something today. Like I learned the word hevel, because you even had like the students I think say like, everybody say hevel with me, like hevel. It's like a person can walk away being like, I know something in Hebrew today. Like it's just a fun little thing. I think it's a little sprinkle of spice and love on there.
Something simple and tangible to kind of grab onto as a takeaway. But anyway, you kind of talked a little bit about one of the benefits is reminding ourselves that there was an original author in a particular place and time writing these messages. The original author of Ecclesiastes is almost certainly King Solomon. He doesn't explicitly state his name, but there's lots of clues in the text that, you know, it's not super debated that King Solomon is the author. And that comes into play. He likely wrote it kind of late in his life. If you know anything about the life of King Solomon, he was the wealthiest king in the history of Israel. He was the king during the height of Israel's power and influence and wealth in the world. And so that matters because with his opening statement here, he says, life cannot be understood, and here's my proof, because I tried it. I tried to figure out what is the meaning of life. How do we find lasting purpose, lasting satisfaction, lasting joy in life? I'm going to try all the things. And so he goes into it in several different places. Throughout these first few chapters, we see it. And then the rest of the book is him kind of just philosophizing almost on those experiments that he ran. But he kind of first goes to learning. He says, I tried to unravel the mysteries of creation and really, you know, basically become a scientist. He's like, I tried to figure out why, you know, the rivers flow the way they flow. I tried to figure out all of this stuff, and I kind of connected that with looking to education as a pathway to peace and hope. And he said that, and he says this in a few places in Ecclesiastes, like there's just some things in life, no matter how hard you try to understand how they work, you'll never be able to fully get your mind around it. And the phrase he uses is what God has made crooked, man cannot make straight. Like there's just some things that God has done that God knows and God understands that we simply can't.
Yeah.
God is one of those things. right? We can't fully wrap our minds around every aspect of who God is, right? He's revealed himself to us as much as we are able to understand and know the infinite, transcendent God of creation.
Yeah, and it goes back to you were saying like what he says, like chasing smoke or like trying to grab the smoke. I think something you said, or maybe it was in the text and you quoted it, however, but just the idea of like the more answers you get, it's almost like the more questions there are. Like if, in terms of like education. And so if you feel like you have to perfectly understand the Bible or perfectly understand God or whatever it is, it can feel like for a second like, oh man, I'm starting to understand it. But then there's more questions and like you're still grabbing at something that you can't fully grasp. Like you said, what I think it's a perfect quote, like what God made crooked, like we can't make straight. Like it might seem like, oh, you're starting to figure something out, but there's always going to be more questions. Like as much as you start to understand one thing, there's always going to be more questions. There's always going to be stuff that you just can't fathom. And so I see what he means by putting all of your effort into trying to grab this thing and you're never going to get it.
Yeah, and so he kind of almost is saying like, we can't, the reason why we can't get control of our life is because we simply lack knowledge. And so if we learn enough, if we research and invent enough technologies, if we discover the mysteries of the universe, if we get enough information, then we can control everything about our life. But you can't. And so he says ultimately pursuing flourishing in that way is a waste of time. So then he moves to hedonism, self-indulgent. He tries pursuing pleasure. And dude was loaded, and he was the king. If you know his story, he ends up like having 1,000 women in his life. Like he talks about in Ecclesiastes, like I planted vineyards so that I never ran out of alcohol, and I had the best wine too. Like I built like these wonderful palaces that had the most luxurious living space possible. And
I think one way you worded it was like basically anything he saw that he wanted, he was like, I'm taking it. Yeah. That was like that adventure.
Yeah, he says in chapter 2, verse 10, whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure. And he said, like, I tried that, and it was very unsatisfying. He's like, because there was never enough. Like, I could never find something that was like, that could please me in a lasting way, right? It's like you get drunk, eventually the alcohol wears off. You sleep around with all these different women, but eventually you realize like that's not what my heart doesn't just want that kind of physical stimulation. It wants something more meaningful, and living my life this way cannot bring the joy and satisfaction that I thought I could bring. So he tries that out, and then he tries the opposite, and he calls it living wisely, but we might say like living kind of a religious life, just doing all the right things, being a good person. It's like maybe that will make me feel fulfilled. Maybe that will make me feel satisfied. And this is a hard one to preach to Christians.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of Christians that are doing this one. Of, the reason why I feel, or the thing that I'm trying to find contentment in life through is banking on going to church every single Sunday. I pay my tithes. I read my Bible every day. I say my prayers, that I was taught to pray when I was a kid. And, I made sure I got dunked at VBS when I was a kid. And, whatever it is. And you realize like that's not enough, right? It's actually exhausting.
Yeah.
If you're banking like, your self-worth on your performance of being a good person, that's exhausting.
Yeah. And I know we talked about, me, you, and Matthew, I think after you gave this message, sat around and you kind of asked us like the smaller questions. We did our own little small group. I forget the wording of the question itself, but you asked like maybe which one of these things we related to the most, or we found ourselves getting caught up in. And I just remember saying and being open about like that one in particular. I find that the times that I get upset with God in a way the most, like the times that I'm mad at God the most, are the times when I'm saying like, well, God, the thing I'm doing is good. Like I'm doing these good things. Like I did this thing. I went and volunteered at this place. I donated money, or I spent my time doing this. I read my Bible this morning like I'm supposed to. I'm being a good person, God. Why aren't things looking good for me? Right. And so I feel like I relate in that sense of what you were trying to say in that message. Like I fully got it, because for that one, that's something, like you said, for Christians is tempting to fall into, is the idea of like, well, I'm doing good, I'm doing this thing, and I even get mad at other people almost, where it's like, well, this thing I'm doing is good, so like you can't be mad about it, or you can't be like, I have the moral high ground here.
Right.
And it comes from pride. It comes from a lot of different places, but I fully relate to that one. Like I find myself getting upset with God or being confused the most after a period of time where I think I've kind of let pride get to me and think, oh, I'm doing all these good things, and then I'm left like, well, do I need to do more good things? Like, am I supposed to do even more? Like, am I not doing good enough? Like, and then I have to ground myself back to reality. But I got that one for sure, and I for sure related to that one, I think, the most.
Yeah. And then another, I didn't really get to talk about it this way in the message, but another way that it comes into play is, I kind of tease this, but like we can never be perfectly good, right? So no matter how hard you try, you're gonna mess up.
Yeah.
Like you're still gonna sin, no matter how much white knuckling you do to try to be as religiously perfect as possible, right? You can be a Pharisee about it, and still you're going to sin. And like I find that the people that bank their life on this one the most are the ones that beat themselves up the most when they mess up. They have no grace for themselves when they slip up, when they make mistakes. And I know I've been there. Like I can really beat myself up when I stumble, when I fall. And it's because in those moments I realized, man, I was banking a little bit too much on this to bring me flourishing. So that's living wisely. The last one he kind of turns to is just hard work, just pouring himself into his work, committing to do his job as good as and as hard as he possibly could. But he found that this too was ultimately a waste of time, and all of these because you're going to die someday, and you are dying. As you're getting older, your body starts to give out. Your mental faculties start to diminish at some point. You start to stop being able to do as much as you were when you were younger. Eventually you die. And so you might be a really successful construction worker who opens his own construction company, and you get very wealthy and you work really hard and you find a lot of satisfaction in your work. But what happens when you can no longer do the work? And it will come one day. I use the example of like sports in the message, right? There's professional athletes. Most professional athletes and most of the big, think like basketball or football, they can't really do that at a professional level past like their late 30s. It's very rare to find professional athletes that continue into their 40s. But even then, like the life expectancy, that's like half your life. What are you gonna do with the rest of your life if that's what you were banking everything on? And he even says in the text, he gives this example essentially of, you might be really successful, but you're gonna die. You can't take it with you, and you might think, well, I have a legacy to pass on. It's like, well, maybe your children will remember you, but then they're gonna have children that are, they have the family business. Eventually someone's going to come along that squanders all your hard work and it's just going to disappear, right? We think of things like Walmart. Like 200 years from now, Walmart's probably not going to exist and nobody's going to know what Walmart is. And the guy that was the creator and founder of, like, I don't even know who that guy is. Nobody cares.
Don't care.
Like, and there might be some people around that still care about that guy, probably because they have money because they were related to him. And then they're going to have kids. Eventually, your name's going to be forgotten. And it's like, what's the point? You can't do anything of lasting impact in this world that's going to have an eternal impact on this world in that way. And so what the author of Ecclesiastes turns to here is this idea of there's all these different paths the world tries to give you to find meaning, to find purpose, and all of them are meaningless. All of them are hevel. All of them are vain attempts, and they all fall short. I'm curious, like for you, Johnny, are there any stories in your life, any moments where you can kind of speak to we talked about this a little bit already, but of just, man, I really banked on this, and you can just remember a moment where it collapsed, of like it didn't work out. I'll answer first. I'll let you think about it. But like I know for me, I remember like this is a stupid story, but really thinking that this job I had was going to be the key to being able to do ministry successfully. And I started working at this insurance job. And it was awful. I'm a terrible insurance salesman. I hated doing it. I wasn't good at all. But going into it, I was convinced. I was like, ministry, there's not a guaranteed paycheck. I know God's calling me to ministry, so really I'm going to help God out here. And I'm going to kind of pin my hopes on this job and into this hard work kind of thing. Like if I just work hard, then the potential risks and dangers of ministry, I can alleviate them. Well, one, it turned out I sucked at the job, so that really didn't work out. But two, I found that as I was doing that, I was actually, even while it was paying the bills, I was not doing as well in my ministry. It was affecting my ability to do ministry well because I wasn't trusting in Christ. I was trusting in my ability and in my work. I was trying to find, I was so afraid of not having a certain standard of living in doing ministry. And I realized I was kind of pinning my hopes for joy in life a little bit on having enough money to be comfortable.
Yeah.
Which kind of ties to the hard work thing. And so I was like, well, the only way for my ministry to be successful is if I have the ability to make enough money to be comfortable while I'm doing it. And God said, no, that ain't gonna work that way. But I was stubborn about it, and I stayed at that job way longer, way past the time I knew God was calling me away from it. And like I ended up so broke that like my car got repossessed, and it took me a year or two to really get back on my feet and recover from that. And I ended up worse off in the long run than I was before I ever even started. And God really taught me in that season, like, you're just gonna have to trust me. Stop pinning your hopes on these other things. Maybe you will be broke. You'll be fine. I'll take care of you, and you'll be satisfied in that. But I don't know. Do you have any examples, perhaps better examples?
Yeah. So I don't know if I'd say better, but for me, for sure, like the same thing. Like jobs. Like when you're in ministry, that's I think a common worry and a common like over exemplified, over hyped like hope that we have of like I want to be comfortable. Like that's something that I still struggle with. It's just like, well, what am I gonna do? Like I know I want to do ministry, but like God, if I'm not able to pay the bills, like I don't know. And that idea of chasing that has led me through several other jobs, and sometimes I get the job where I'm like, this one's it, and then it's just like it's only there for a little bit. But I know one that you and I just coincidentally talked about like a little bit at camp was like relationships. Like Cody over here, one and done. But I've had several moments where just, especially when I was in high school and through college, where I just thought that like once I got that relationship, once I found the one, that was going to be like the key, and then all of life's problems were going to go away.
Yeah.
Like I would never have any other worries because like I have a girlfriend or I have a wife, and then I get married, and then after that everything would be sunshine and rainbows because that was the key. Like I pursued it so heavily, and thankfully by God's grace, like you said this I think last episode, like I wasn't ready. Like if I had somehow figured that out, and that it would have been unhealthy. I would have idolized it. It would have probably separated me from God more. I probably would have ended horribly, is my guess. But thankfully God kept those things for me to help me figure that out. Like you're chasing after something that's not going to give you what I could give you. Like you're chasing after these things. And so often I felt like I put just everything, like my mind would be consumed by like, I have to be with this person. Like I have to, I'm so nervous just waiting for them to text me back and all this stuff, to where it was what I genuinely thought was like, this is what I'm working for. This is what it means. Like, this is what it's like to live. And again, I talked about last episode, like watching Phineas and Ferb and Drake and Josh and stuff and iCarly, whatever. I think part of that came from like on TV and media, how overhyped like romance and stuff is on there. Like every TV show, like you think of just an easy example is like The Office. Yes, The Office is funny here and there, but like what's the core plot like you're coming back for? It's Jim and Pam. Jim and Pam are like so hyped up, and then like there's a whole episode. It's like the season finale, and there's music when they finally get together and stuff. And a lot of TV shows and movies do that. Like even superhero movies, it's like yeah, the superhero's cool and they're fighting, but it's like in the end they get the girl and they make it seem like everything's gonna be perfect and happily ever after once they get the girl. And so I think I let that get into my mind enough where I was thinking like, well, if I just, especially here too, like around where we live, like in the South, like so many people get married young, like so fast, and it's easy like to be kind of around our age and like see all these people. Oh, yep, they got out of college, they got married, they got a house, they got a job, and boom, done. And I was thinking like, well, if I could just have all that happen, then I will have peace. Then like I'll find like the meaning of life basically once I get the wife and the house and the big dog in the yard, and I'll just everything's gonna be perfect once I find this thing. And God has continuously just shown me like it's not what it's about. Yeah. Not what it's all about.
Yeah, and you know, some of you that are listening, you might be younger, some of you might be older, and I found that with age, you experience more and more and more these things that you're banking your hopes and dreams on. It always fails to deliver what it promises. Even if you get what you're looking for, like you achieve your dreams, you know, you get to the mountaintop and you realize, oh, there's another mountain that's taller than this one. And you look around, it's like, I'm the only one up here. Like, I can't, like, I had to sacrifice a lot to get this. And, like, what did I really get? I'm alone on top of a mountain. I'm cold. Like, you know, there's another mountain to climb. No one really cares. Like, this is what the Kohelet, the author of Ecclesiastes, is saying. Life is meaningless. Life is hevel. And it's exhausting. It's, you know, there's so many people in this world that aren't surviving, that aren't living, they're just surviving. They're just running from death. I like old school Lecrae. I don't like new school Lecrae as much. One of old school Lecrae's best songs was Breathe Into Death. He says, help me, Lord, before there's no time left. I'm not living, I'm just breathing to death. And that's what so many of us that's the place so many of us find ourselves in. And it's into that just vexing question that has perplexed humanity. You know, the question philosophers and kings and common people have been asking for millennia. What is the meaning of life? It's into that question that Jesus enters into, and he says, in my opinion, probably one of the thesis statement passages of the Gospel of Matthew 11, 28 through 30. He says, come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And so into this kind of, you know, hamster wheel, rat race kind of life that we're living, Jesus enters in. He says, you know, you can get off the treadmill. You know, he gives us purpose. That's what the yoke represents there, right? All these different paths, you know, education, hedonism, religion, hard work. There are all these different yokes, these different paths, philosophies, ways of living that try to that promise fulfillment.
Yeah. What's a yoke?
A yoke is like this thing that you place on a beast of burden to control it. Typically, it's a farming term, so you can think of like you've got like an ox, and you put this like wooden beam on its shoulders, and there's straps that attach the beam to a plow, and it allows you to take the energy of the ox to pull and work the plow, and it lets the farmer direct the ox. And it's intentionally kind of heavy so it's easier to control the ox, and all these different things. There's these yokes that the world places on us, and you can never go without a yoke. That's a lie. It's an illusion that we tend to think that we can find a yoke-free life, but you know, that's just hedonism. Is just, you know, I'm just going to stop doing anything other than pleasing myself, that's a
Right.
yoke too. And eventually, like, they grind us into the dirt. They weigh us down. We run out of energy and we collapse. But Jesus says, my yoke is easy. My yoke is light. So I'm going to give you a purpose that's not going to wear you down. In fact, it'll give you rest.
Come on.
I'm going to give you a purpose that's not going to get you to the end of the day and you look back and feel like, what am I doing? It's, you get to the end of your life and you look back and say, man, I lived for Christ. And so because Christ is eternal and because his mission is eternal, he's invited me to join into that work. And so even my little contributions have eternal ramifications, because it's a part of his plan. And that is the only thing that brings peace. Jesus said, peace I give to you, my peace I give to you, or peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. It's a peace that surpasses all understanding, a peace that this world cannot swallow up. And that's the key. That's what the Gospel of Matthew is about. Is Matthew is presenting the gospel as a way of life, that following Jesus is a way to true life, to true living, to true satisfaction. And that for us is what we're living for. So whenever I titled the message Call to Live, it's like, we're all dead in our sins. We're all dead men walking in this world, not living. We're just breathing to death. And Jesus is calling us to live by trusting in him and following him. And that it does take trust to do that, because you can't taste true life until you place your faith in Jesus.
Yeah.
So you're having to bank on him. But we have the weight of, thousands of years of church history, thousands of millions upon millions of believers testifying that it's true. And I can testify, I know Johnny would testify that that's true. That the more we can embrace the Jesus way of life, the more we can find a joy and a peace that surpasses all understanding. It's not to say that there's not suffering in this world, but even our suffering finds purpose in Christ, because we can know him in our sufferings. We can show the world what hope that is unshakable looks like by enduring our suffering with hope and joy. So even in that, we can find meaning in those things. And so we talk about that. This was a bit of a heavy kind of philosophical topic for students, but to try to ground it, I asked them to consider, what would it look like to take the little things in your life and make them about Jesus? Because what Ecclesiastes isn't saying is, well, because education can't bring you satisfaction, that means you shouldn't care about learning things.
Exactly, right.
He's saying, do it for Jesus.
Yep.
He's not saying even, like, God gives us pleasurable things as a gift. As you're talking about this a little bit in the last episode, right? Like, why is there diversity? Why do we have so many different games that we can play, different sports we can play? Why are there different colors that we can wear? Why are there different flavors of food we can eat? Because God wants us to enjoy life. But if you make the pleasure the point, that's where it becomes a problem. You make the pleasure a way to honor and worship God and be thankful to God. It draws you near to him. Hard work is a value. It's a virtue. But work hard for the kingdom of God, so that your work has an everlasting and eternal purpose. Religion, there's clear answers there. Like, why am I going to church every Sunday and reading my Bible? It's not so that I can justify myself. It's not so that I can feel good about myself and wash my shame away. Jesus already did that on the cross. I'm doing it because I love God and I want to draw near to him and I want to serve him as well as I can. So, the challenge then is to figure out, not how do I remove everything from my life that's not sitting around meditating on God's word, although meditating on God's word is good. It's how do I be a normal person and make everything about Jesus that I'm doing. So I guess just what's an example for you of a time where you've had to really reckon with that, of this is something that's taking up a lot of my time and my weekly schedule, that's not obviously Christ-centered. How do I make it about Jesus?
I think the first thing that comes to my mind is, like, I'll speak to the athletes, man. Like, when I was in college, I walked onto the soccer team. I think I've talked about that a little bit before, just on different areas of the channel. But I never played soccer in my life until college. But I was just around it. I had great friends that were on the women's soccer team, and the women's soccer coach at the time, thankfully, was a great man of God. And through my connections there, I just started loving it, walked on the soccer team. Because of how much I loved it, I was like, dude, you give me a jersey, I'll run every time you tell me to run. I'll jump every time you tell me to jump. Like, I just love the sport. I fell in love because I've always been an athlete. I played basketball and golf in high school. But through that, like, soccer took up most of my time. Like, I was missing some campus ministry stuff for soccer. And it was just like, okay, well, what am I going to do here? Like, am I still able to do ministry? Because soccer for me, like, I knew I wasn't going pro. Like, I know I'm not building up any sort of nest egg or like potential future from soccer. It's more so just something that I'm really enjoying, and it keeps me fit in a way. Like, but other than that, like, what is soccer going to do for me in 30 years? So I'm just kind of reckoning with that time that I was spending, and ultimately what it led to was I founded FCA at the college that I went to. Like, we didn't have a branch of FCA there, is the way I guess you would properly word it, but I met with like the FCA director for like our region, and I signed some papers, and I started an FCA there. And we like prayed, like I got the team to pray and stuff with us too. We started like a little men's Bible study on our soccer team. And those things didn't necessarily stick or land or have as much fruit at the time. But since I've been around, going back to my alma mater, back to where I went to school, the FCA, when I was there that I started, had sometimes 2 people would show up other than me and my best friend Jonah, who's been on the podcast before. We would have like 2 people show up to FCA, and then I think by my senior year we would sometimes get like 9 or 10, and I was like, this is lit. Like 9 or 10 people are showing up to FCA.
Yeah, that's awesome.
But I just went to their Fields of Faith event, which they had, which is through FCA at the place I went to college. And when I went back and looked at their FCA, I mean, there are church fans pulling up. Like there was 380 people at their FCA event, and it's like, dang. When I was there, I started this little FCA thing with 2 people showing up. Later, there was like 9 or 10. And it was just something that came about because God gave me this gift of athletics. Mm-hmm. And then I was like, okay, cool. Why am I doing this? What am I going to do with this gift that God has given me? What am I going to do with these things that I'm spending all of my time doing? How can I make this for God to some degree? And thankfully, through that, the little bitty seeds that I planted, God was able to be like, cool, you gave me a little bit of your time when you were playing soccer. Like, you took soccer and gave it to me, even just a little bit, because I'm the first person to admit, like, I wasn't perfect. And, like, being in a locker room with a bunch of dudes, like, I'm not always 100% the perfect Christian in there, but, like, because I tried my best to make it for God, God said, cool, that's all I needed. Now it's going to be this amazing thing.
Yeah. I know the example I always give, and you've heard me say this a million times, is Dungeons and Dragons, right? Mm-hmm. We both play Dungeons and Dragons. We've talked about it before.
We're gonna have to have a D&D episode.
Yeah, well, it'll happen. Yeah. I remember vividly when I first started getting into running the game, and it just takes a lot of time out of your schedule, which I know there's probably some people who are like, that sounds weird, why would you do that? But hey, you know what, that's my thing, don't make fun of me. It was taking up a lot of my time, and I just felt, I had a conviction from the Spirit of how can I justify giving so much of my time and energy and brain space to this game? Like, how can I make it about God? And I prayed through it, and there's a few ways. One, it's an easy avenue to build relationships with people that I would otherwise not be friends with. We're basically friends because we play D&D together. Yep. Which has led to us being able to do this and to do fall retreat together, right? Stuff like that. And me and Matthew are friends because of that. And I've made friends with people who are atheists playing D&D, who I've had over at my house, and I've had gospel conversations because they came over to play D&D and we hung out afterwards to eat some food. So it has that element. It's a creative outlet, and there's value purely in that, in expressing the image of God and creativity. Right? God is a creator, and we reflect him when we create things. And so there's almost a degree of worship in it to me of, I'm going to do the best I can to create something that's interesting and cool, purely so that I can reflect who I am as created in the image of God, and give thanks to God that I have the ability to do this, and maybe just give it as a fun gift that is for my friends and me, and so it has that element to it, and there's other things too, but just I guess to land the plane here, because I'm sure we're out of time. I'd encourage you to think through how are you spending your time? What are the things in your life that are taking up the most of your time and energy? It could be your family, it could be your job, it could be a hobby, whatever. What would it look like for you to make Christ the purpose of those things? To bring Christ into those things? Pray about that. Consider that. You'd be surprised what God can do with things that seem like the most random things. So consider that, pray on that. But yeah, that's what I think we've got for this episode.
I'll say too, you kind of ended with Colossians 3:17, right?
Yes.
I don't know if you have that written on there, but
yeah, whatever you do in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus.
Yeah.
Giving thanks to God the Father through him. And so like if you're, just like what am I supposed to be doing? That's a good catch-all verse for what does it look like to follow Jesus? Just do your best to do everything in a way that honors him.
Yeah, and we can sometimes overhype that and make it seem like, well, what's this grand, amazing thing that I need to do for Jesus? And while that's certainly cool, like if you feel like God's leading you down some route to do something big, then awesome. But it can literally just be like, what's on your schedule today? Oh, you need to go grocery shopping and you need to go run some errands today. Cool. Like, how can you make grocery shopping for the Lord? I know it sounds weird, but it's like, is there going to be somebody in there that you need to pray for? Is there going to be somebody that you need to be like patient with? Like when the person checking out like your groceries is like taking forever, but then you're the first person to like not comment on how slow they are, and instead you give them a compliment. Like what if that makes their day, and then that person, like, you never know.
Yeah, it could even be as simple as how can I grocery shop in a way that stewards my money well, so that I'm not being wasteful with what God has given me, so that I can use my money for other things, and not just all of it goes to my grocery bill. How can I buy groceries if you have a family that you're buying groceries for? How am I buying groceries that aren't just buying what I want to eat, but buying food that my spouse likes or my kids like? It's not all about me, right? So it's that kind of stuff too. Yeah.
So again, teasing you for the next one. Like we said, Cody and I's messages, we kind of went back and forth. So next episode, I'll go back to my message, and it was cool that Cody used Colossians 3:17, and Cody told me later, after I had already sent him my notes, that he loves Colossians 3 so much, and I had used in one of the devotions I wrote, or I made like one of the smaller questions, I can't remember, but one of the things that I wrote for the students, I had used a passage in Colossians 3, and then in the next message that I'll talk on in the next episode, I used another passage in Colossians 3. So we were all about Colossians 3, and it just worked out that everything tied together so well. So if you want to hear more, about that, stick around for the next episode next week. Let us know in the comments if there was anything that you really liked about this episode, anything you have more questions on that Cody and I would love to answer. But we're going to get out of here for this one, and we'll see you in the next one.